What's going on, everybody? This is the Reformation Keegan, and I'm here with another really cool analysis. So, today we have Tom King's Mr. Miracle. And this is one I've wanted to read for quite a while. I finally picked this up at one of the local comic stores sales. It was their anniversary sale not too long ago, and this was a must have for me. So, I actually got this for half off. But I'm going to just say full disclosure, it's worth paying full price to read this. So you can already probably connect the dots on what my thoughts are on the story itself. But there's a lot to unpack with Mr. Miracle. And this is a really good example of how when Tom King is given something to really sink his teeth into, it becomes a masterpiece. And I don't say that lightly because the term masterpiece is used a lot and the term classic is used a lot, but I really do believe that Mr. Miracle is a modern classic. So I'm going to unpack some things about this book. I'm going to try to not make it like a summary, but I want to give a little bit of analysis with this because I think there are a lot of philosophical implications that are pretty much omnipresent within this entire narrative. So I want to start too by saying that this is really a story about not just the anti-life equation, but it's also about Scott's origin. And it depends on how we describe origin, because is origin birth or is an origin a beginning? So this is something that you kind of have to decipher. A beginning, at least in my opinion, from what I've learned in my experiences, is an extension of an origin. So for example, if you have an origin which is the nucleus, the complete middle, you're going to have branches, and those extended branches are beginnings because beginnings are different for everybody. And I think for Scott Free, his origin is that he was born, obviously, but then his beginnings are the extensions that make up his own experiences. So it starts when he's sent to Darkseid in Apocalypse. So what happens is he was traded by the High Father and sent to Apocalypse in this trade to help end the war that was going on between New Genesis and Apocalypse. And he tries to repeatedly escape, and he gets the nickname Scott Free by Granny Goodness. So what we learn is that the name Scott Free is a colloquialism, but also it shows how he becomes the escape artist known as Mr. Miracle. And he's trying to escape due to abuse. And we can see also too how this version of Granny Goodness is also incorporated in Smallville. So if you ever watch Smallville, Granny Goodness is leading an orphanage, and Tess Mercer, who we find out to be Lex Luthor's sister, is a former resident there. And we can see how those experiences with Granny Goodness have traumatized her. And also how Granny Goodness is an agent of Darkseid. So there's a lot going on here. And Darkseid and Highfather initially they agree to trade their sons to help end this war that's occurring. But what happens is it becomes very consequential for both Orion and for Scott Free. And within all of this tragedy, he meets his wife Barda, who is a part of Apocalypse, but she eventually defects and she ends up getting with Scott, and they stay together for happily ever after. So one of the things that was really interesting was Big Barda was very insecure about her height. And this exudes femininity in a way where there's supposed to be a status quo for how individuals are supposed to look like. And this is an insecurity that Barda deals with. However, Scott always tries to remind her of how beautiful she is and how gorgeous she is and how much she means to him, even though he's in his own perpetual philosophical despair. So that shows how Barda is more important than she thinks she is, not just to herself, but also to Scott. And one of the things that was super interesting with Barda here is in one of the scenes, you have Granny Goodness, and she asks Barda if she remembers when she wasn't allowed to drink water for 2 weeks. And this is happening while Stormforge has to look at food but can't eat it. And that's a huge, huge struggle. Like, imagine if you are being starved by somebody and then you hear somebody chomping on their food or drinking water. That's got to be a level of emotional agony that is almost unfathomable to the average human being. So that's stuff that Barta had to see, but also endure. So two there's two factors here that equate to post-traumatic stress disorder that are still present to this day in the Mr. Miracle universe. And for some reason, this particular segment reminded me of how people were treated in boarding schools, where they would be confined and starved, and it's rather unfortunate. And this is something that I think is very realistic, and I think Tom King does a really good job at exemplifying political and socioeconomic realism through Barda. So I think that was a really strong point of the series. And one of the other segments that I found super interesting as well was how Orion puts Mr. Miracle on trial, thinking that he's committed treason and operates as an agent of Darkseid. And he calls Scott brother all the time, and Scott's like, I'm not your brother. And in a lot of ways they're similar, but in various ways they're very different too. So both of them are similar and different at the same time. Their similarities and differences are really juxtaposed, in my opinion. And for Orion, the truth is what you believe, which equates to the dogmatic quote, perception is reality. So in life, perception oftentimes is reality. It's a rather unfortunate fact, but it is true. Perceptions become fact. And even if you don't have the evidence to prove those facts, or vice versa, that ongoing perception is going to stay within the human mind, and that perception is going to dictate what's real and what's not, which is, again, a paradox. And it shouldn't be that way in a lot of times, but that's how it is. So perception is reality, which acts as a truth. And this becomes apparent when Orion asks Scott if people could be an agent of Darkseid without knowing they are. So there's a sense of obliviousness to being an agent of Darkseid and to the anti-life equation. So this is where we enter the anti-life equation, because it's something that Scott lives through this entire series. So, like I mentioned earlier, we find out that Scott's name is a colloquialism, and how Granny Goodness names him that because he was always trying to escape. Then he adopted the name of Mr. Miracle after someone else. So we see how Scott tries to find out who he really is while under the anti-life equation, while living with no to minimal hope. So it gets intriguing because he's been living as two concurrent entities, which means that as two different gimmicks or even two different people, Scott Free's been living as Scott Free and Mr. Miracle at the exact same time. And he doesn't really know who he truly is yet. And, you know, the thing is, he's becoming, in a sense, normalized throughout being abnormal. So this becomes his new normal, to live as two different people, because, again, he's under the anti-life equation. So Orion eventually, throughout all of this turmoil, deems Scott guilty on pages 104 and 105. So I'll show you a quick panel of this, because the 9-grid panel, I think, works exceptionally well, especially in dialogue like this, where we can see for a fact how the 9-panel grid is keeping the conversation going smoothly. And we can also see how there's a sense of repetition with these questions and answers, where basically Scott is just saying true for the sake of saying true, because, again, if we go back to the perception is reality dogma, it doesn't matter what actually is true, it matters what you believe is true. So there's a sense of fact and belief that are compartmentalized here, and they operate essentially as one. So I found that very intriguing. And one of the things that was really interesting, again, was the way that Barda consoles Scott. And there's a quote on page 108, fast forward, which says, "Doesn't she come from Apocalypse, where Holocaust is a household word?" So if we take our definition of Holocaust now, we can understand how both Barda and Scott Free have undergone this systematic oppression that they really can't fully find their way out of. And it also, in my opinion, represents the anti-life equation as its own form of philosophical Holocaust, which basically derives from stealing hope and giving the subject at play here, which is Scott Free, philosophical despair and pessimism. So that, I think that term right there exemplifies everything that I've been stating thus far. And what we learn is that the anti-life equation has affected Scott basically since he tries to commit suicide in the first issue, or does commit suicide, depending on how you interpret the story. Because maybe Scott's dead and this is just an alternate reality, or maybe Scott fully survived the suicide and he's living with the fact that he's dead inside, but his existential self is still alive. Take that as you may. However, having Jacob Free as his son has, in a way, renewed his hope throughout the anti-life equation. So there is that proverbial glimmer of hope within this anti-life equation that is keeping Scott going, and also showing Scott that his responsibilities, albeit there are a lot of them, are what gives him hope and the fortitude to get up in the morning and move forward. You know, like such as being a good husband to Barda and now being a good father. So, and also trying to live throughout wartime, which is also another huge sign of post-traumatic stress disorder that we do see with Scott. So what we see is the anti-life equation acting as a narcotic. And what I mean by that is the anti-life equation kind of operates as this addictive drug that enters somebody's system without them knowing it, right? So usually somebody who takes drugs, they make the choice to do it. However, Darkseid is the supplier, and Darkseid is that supplier that is supplying that drug against somebody's will. So this is a narcotic that is used against somebody's will and taking away their daily lives, basically, which I find, again, to be a really poignant way of showing how PTSD operates as something that is in somebody's consciousness and they can't control it. So Mr. Miracle also negotiates with Kalibak, which again is a massive segment in this story and very important, because Darkseid is willing to surrender the anti-life equation, but with Darkseid there's always a catch, because Darkseid predicates off of power and control. And he'll surrender the anti-life equation, but only in exchange for Jacob Free. So again, this is a very almost ritualistic situation here, where it's like, we will stop controlling you. We will give up all that our desires want from you, but you have to give us your most important thing in the world, and that is your firstborn son. So if that sounds familiar in religious context, that's what I think this is from. So there's almost a sense of intertextuality here that Tom King is deriving his content from. And the other thing that's, again, intriguing is the mirror. So this is a mirror from Granny Goodness, basically, and the mirror is a symbolic form of past trauma. And this is a reflection of Scott's past and present. So Granny's actions leave a huge scar on Scott throughout all of this abuse, because when you're younger, your consciousness for some reason loves to take all those traumatic instances and keep them within your mind and not let them go. So when you're thinking about them, you almost become like that helpless child that you once were. So, and that mirror is a reflection of that. So the mirror is a very symbolic part of this story. And I think what the mirror does is it has Scott look in the mirror at himself and not just analyze the life that he's living under the anti-life equation, but it also shows him in a way how far he's come and how those past demons in the form of Granny Goodness and Apocalypse are just basically a rear view mirror, but also they're there to actually give Scott hope. So to play devil's advocate, Scott reliving his past is actually going to give him the fortitude to move forward in this perpetual state of nothingness, which is the anti-life equation. So, and also more themes, I think, of Mr. Miracle derive from living during wartime, like I had stated a bit earlier. But another thing to point out is the third person narration at the beginning and the conclusion of most of, if not all, these issues. So this is a tribute to Jack Kirby, first of all, because Tom King's a huge Jack Kirby fan, and Jack Kirby is responsible for putting Mr. Miracle on the map. But in addition, the third person narration provides closure for the stories conveyed, because almost this whole time we have dialogue and a first person recounting. But I think the third person narration gives a sense of story for the comic, where it gives that sense of closure at the end, and you can close that chapter and then start the new one in the new issue. And I think that works really well here, especially with how classic of a character that Mr. Miracle is. I think it makes sense to have these third person narrations at the end. So in this story, like I said, the anti-life equation, which I've said a lot already, but there's still a lot to say about it, paradoxically keeps Scott Free alive. And to be alive in this case is to suffer. And when Scott declines Metron's invitation to go back to his time, which looks like 2018 Justice League, he stays in emotional purgatory, because in a way, in a very poignant way, he becomes comfortable with all of life's proverbial glitches. And we can see the glitches where Scott is, mid-thought or talking, and then we get the dark side is glitch, which is also a symbolization of the anti-life equation and how it is controlling Scott's emotional range and personal consciousness. And Scott is almost acquiescing to these glitches and just living through them. And sometimes in life, what you have to do is you have to live through necessary evils in order to find who you are and to find where your stance is in your life. And I think what it does is it personifies philosophical despair in a nutshell. And I know I've said that term a couple times already, but I'm really trying to nail it home. And the use of profanity is another thing I wanted to mention quick, just on the language side. It's meant to be a colloquial representation to Scott's humanity, between that human and God juxtaposition. And additionally, when he says fuck you to Darkseid, that's almost unprecedented, because Darkseid is presented as this gigantic being that can control anything that he desires, and now Scott Free has a little bit of control in this anti-life equation, especially when him and Barda eventually take out Darkseid and they stab him right through the eye, which actually weakens Darkseid. And it's not often you see Darkseid vulnerable or weakened. And what I think this image is showing is that even if you're under something like the anti-life equation, if you have enough fortitude and you have the interpersonal knowledge to know what your weaknesses are, you can combat a lot of the inner hostility that you're having and the socioeconomic agony you're undergoing by not just standing up for yourself, but for believing in what's right and believing what you believe in the most, which could be your family or even yourself, or even something else like some form of higher power that most of us cannot communicate with. So again, the paradox of reality in this story is one of those things where you're not supposed to have the answer, but you're meant to theorize. Because I think if you always have the answer, then things get a bit boring and things get very stagnant. But I believe this book is a modern day masterpiece. It's an absolute classic, and it's one where I think you can read more than once. You can probably read this 3 or 4 times, and you're still gonna pick out stuff that you didn't pick up the first time you've read it. Because I'm for sure going to read this again, because I think there's even more to unpack. But this is just my analysis from an English major's point of view for now. So in relation to that, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, because I'll be back with more content very shortly. I'm going to be reading a lot more over the next month or so. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe, because we're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers, and then if we hit that plus 3,000 watch hours, I can put out more and better content for you going forward. And most of all, keep those interactions up. Let me know what you think of Mr. Miracle. Let me know what you think of Tom King's writing. Let me know what you think of the art, which I didn't talk about as much, but the art is absolutely fantastic. And most of all, take care.